Vince McMahon once screamed the words, "I hated him," about a wrestler who dared to challenge his power. For decades, Vince ran WWE like a king. He built an empire. But behind the scenes, his grudges were legendary. Some wrestlers made one mistake and paid for it their entire careers. Others crossed lines Vince would never forgive. Tonight, we reveal the 10 wrestlers who felt the full force of Vince's rage. These weren't just business decisions. They were personal wars. These were feuds that lasted decades. Some ended in reconciliation. Others ended in permanent exile. A few ended only when Vince himself lost power. Vince McMahon was more than just a wrestling promoter. He was a force of nature. He transformed wrestling from regional territories into a global entertainment empire. He created WrestleMania. He made wrestling mainstream. He turned performers into household names. But with that power came a dark side. Vince's temper was legendary. His grudges were deeper than any storyline. His memory for slights was perfect. And his capacity for revenge seemed endless. Why did Vince explode on some wrestlers, but forgive others who hurt his business even more? The answer reveals everything about how Vince really operated. Some betrayals he could forgive if the money was right. Other offenses crossed lines he would never forget. The difference between forgiveness and exile often came down to ego, to personal pride, to family honor. Understanding these 10 feuds means understanding the man who controlled wrestling for 40 years. Let's start with the moment that changed wrestling forever. November 9th, 1997, Montreal, Canada, Survivor Series. This was the night Vince McMahon proved he would do anything to protect his power. Bret Hart was the WWF champion. He was one of the biggest stars in the company. He had been with WWE for years. He was loyal. He was trusted. He was beloved by fans around the world. But business was changing. WWE was struggling financially. WCW was winning the ratings war. Stars were jumping ship for bigger contracts. Bret Hart was one of them. Bret had signed a lucrative contract with rival company WCW. It was a 20-year deal, guaranteed money. It was an offer Vince couldn't match. Vince actually encouraged Bret to take it. WWE was in financial trouble. They couldn't afford Bret's contract anymore, so Bret agreed to leave. But there was a problem. Bret was still the WWF champion. He needed to drop the title before moving to WCW. Bret was willing to do this. He was a professional. He understood the business. He agreed to drop the title before his departure, but Bret had conditions. He refused to lose to Shawn Michaels in Canada. This was his home country. Bret and Shawn had real-life heat. They genuinely disliked each other. Shawn had made disrespectful comments about Bret's family. Shawn had caused problems backstage. Bret felt that losing to Michaels in Canada would be disrespectful to his fans, to his legacy, to his integrity as a performer. Bret had creative control in his contract. This meant he could veto finishes. He could decide how he lost the title, and he exercised that right. He said no to losing in Montreal. Vince had a problem, a big problem. He feared Bret would appear on WCW television with the WWF Championship belt. This had happened before in wrestling history. When a champion showed up on another show with your title, it destroyed credibility. It made your championship look meaningless. It made your company look weak. Vince couldn't risk that. He couldn't trust that Bret would return the belt before appearing on WCW television. So Vince made a choice that would define his character for the rest of his career. Vince decided to screw Bret Hart. He ordered referee Earl Hebner to end the match early. The plan was secret. Only a handful of people knew. Shawn Michaels put Bret in a submission hold, the sharpshooter, Bret's own finishing move. Then referee Earl Hebner called for the bell. He signaled that Bret had submitted, but Bret never tapped out. He never gave up. He wasn't supposed to lose yet. The bell rang anyway. Shawn Michaels was declared the new WWF champion. Bret was shocked, confused, then furious. He had been betrayed on live television, in his home country, in front of his fans, by a man he trusted. This became known as the Montreal Screwjob. It is arguably the most talked about event in wrestling history. Wrestling fans still debate it today. Some say Vince had no choice. Some say it was the ultimate betrayal. Some think Bret was in on it the whole time. But most evidence suggests Bret was legitimately screwed. He didn't know what was happening until the bell rang. Backstage, chaos erupted. Bret was furious. He destroyed equipment in the locker room. He smashed monitors. He flipped tables. He was a man betrayed. Then he went looking for Vince. He had trusted Vince. They had worked together for over a decade. Bret had given WWE his prime years, his health, his loyalty, and Vince had repaid him with public humiliation. Bret found Vince in the locker room. They talked briefly. Then Bret punched Vince in the face. It was a real punch, not a wrestling work. This was legitimate anger. This was betrayal meeting rage. The punch landed hard. Vince went down. The entire wrestling world heard about it. Some people who were there said Vince deserved it. Others said Bret crossed a line, but everyone understood why it happened. Vince had violated trust to maintain control. He chose his company over his word. He prioritized the championship belt over a decade-long relationship. This moment defined who Vince really was. A man who would do anything to protect his empire. A man who valued power over loyalty. This moment was so profound it changed wrestling forever. It created the Mr. McMahon character on television. Before this, Vince was just an announcer to most fans. They didn't know he owned the company. After Montreal, Vince became a character, the evil boss, the corporate tyrant. He turned real-life conflict into storyline gold. He became the villain everyone loved to hate. The Mr. McMahon character fueled the Attitude Era. It created the Stone Cold Steve Austin storyline. It made Vince a television star in his own right. In a twisted way, screwing Bret Hart made Vince richer than ever. The feud with Bret lasted years. They didn't speak for almost a decade. Bret went to WCW feeling bitter, betrayed. He never forgot what Vince did, but eventually, as always with Vince, business won. In 2006, Bret returned to WWE. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame. It was an emotional moment. Later, Bret even wrestled Vince at WrestleMania. They made money together again. The grudge ended because there was profit in reconciliation. Money healed this wound. Vince forgave Bret because Bret could still draw crowds. Because Bret's name still meant something. Because nostalgia sells. The lesson was clear. If you made Vince money, he would forgive almost anything, but not everything. Some wrestlers crossed lines Vince would never forget. Now let's count down the 10 wrestlers who felt Vince's hatred most deeply. These are the names that made Vince lose sleep. The performers he blacklisted, mocked, or destroyed. Each story reveals something dark about how Vince ran his empire. These aren't ranked by talent. They're ranked by the depth of Vince's animosity, by how personal the grudge became, by how long the hatred lasted. Some of these wrestlers made business mistakes. Others made personal enemies. A few simply didn't fit Vince's narrow vision of what a star should look like. But all of them paid a price. All of them learned that crossing Vince McMahon had consequences that lasted years or even decades. Before WWE existed, wrestling was organized into territories. Different promoters controlled different regions. They worked together loosely, they respected boundaries, but Vince McMahon wanted to change that. He wanted national domination. He wanted to destroy the territory system and replace it with one company. His company. He succeeded, but that success required ruthlessness. It required a willingness to crush anyone who stood in his way. That same ruthlessness applied to his own roster. If you helped him, he might reward you. If you crossed him, he would destroy you. The 10 wrestlers on this countdown learned this lesson the hard way. Number 10, Rusev. Rusev was talented. Everyone could see it. Fans loved him. He had charisma. He could wrestle. He had a great look. He was intimidating but also entertaining. He came to WWE with his manager Lana. They worked as a heel team. Rusev played an anti-American foreign villain. It was an old wrestling trope, but Rusev made it work. He won matches. He built momentum. He became United States champion. Everything was going according to plan. WWE was building a new star, but then something happened that Vince couldn't control. Something organic. Something real. In 2017, Rusev Day became incredibly popular. It started as a joke. Rusev declared every day Rusev Day. He would celebrate himself. It was comedic, but also charming. Fans started bringing Rusev Day signs to shows. They chanted Rusev Day at live events. They bought Rusev Day merchandise. The reaction was organic, genuine, loud. Rusev wasn't supposed to be a fan favorite. He was supposed to be a villain, but the audience decided they loved him anyway. They chose him, not because WWE told them to, but because Rusev connected with them naturally. This created a problem for Vince. He hated when wrestlers became popular without his approval. He had a specific vision for who should be a star. He handpicked his main eventers. He decided who got pushed. When someone became popular organically, it challenged his authority. It suggested the audience knew better than he did. Vince couldn't tolerate that. His ego wouldn't allow it. So despite all the evidence that Rusev was connecting, Vince cooled him off. He stopped pushing him. He gave him bad storylines. He made sure Rusev never reached the top. The creative direction for Rusev became insulting. They put him in a love triangle storyline. They had him lose matches he should have won. They took away his momentum piece by piece. Fans kept chanting for Rusev Day. They kept showing support, but it didn't matter. Vince had made his decision. Rusev would not be a main event star. Not because he lacked talent. Not because fans didn't care, but because Vince didn't pick him. Because his popularity wasn't manufactured. Because he succeeded without permission. This was pure pettiness. Vince had a star ready to make him money. Rusev was over with the crowd. His merchandise was selling, he was drawing reactions. Every metric suggested he deserved a push, but Vince's ego got in the way. He couldn't stand that Rusev became popular on his own terms, so he sabotaged the momentum. He made sure Rusev stayed in the mid-card. He wasted years of potential. Eventually, Rusev left WWE. He went to AEW, where he became Miro. There he was given creative freedom. He became TNT champion. He showed what he could have been all along. The Rusev story reveals Vince's insecurity. He needed absolute control over every aspect of his show. When something happened naturally, when the audience made their own choice, it threatened his authority. He would rather kill organic popularity than admit he didn't have total control. This wasn't about business. Rusev was making money. This was about ego, about power, about a man who built an empire but couldn't handle when his subjects chose their own heroes. Number 9. Gail Kim. Gail Kim was a talented female wrestler. She could work. She understood psychology. She had athleticism that stood out. But WWE didn't treat women's wrestling seriously during her time there. This was before the women's revolution, before WWE started calling female wrestlers women instead of divas. In Gail's era, women's matches were short. They were treated as bathroom breaks. They rarely got meaningful storylines. The focus was on looks over ability, on drama over wrestling. This frustrated many talented female performers. Gail Kim was one of them. Gail felt disrespected. She felt the company ignored female talent. She watched as women who could really wrestle were given 3-minute matches. She saw talented performers reduced to eye candy. She experienced the creative disregard firsthand. The storylines were bad. The matches were rushed. The women's division was an afterthought. Gail tried to push through it. She tried to make the best of bad situations, but the frustration built over time. Eventually, it reached a breaking point. One night during a live match, Gail did something shocking. She was in a battle royal. Multiple women in the ring. The goal was to throw opponents over the top rope. The last woman standing wins. But Gail didn't want to wait. She didn't want to play along anymore, so she eliminated herself. She climbed over the rope and walked away. Just left. During a live match, on television, in front of millions of viewers. It was her way of protesting, her way of saying this is pointless, her way of showing her frustration with how women were treated. The wrestling world noticed. Fans talked about it. Other wrestlers talked about it. And Vince definitely noticed. He hated public defiance. He hated anyone who made the company look bad on television. Wrestling is built on illusion, on maintaining the facade. When someone breaks that illusion intentionally, it damages the product. It makes everything look fake. It reminds fans that none of it matters. Vince couldn't tolerate that. It was disrespect. It was rebellion. It was making him look bad in front of his audience. Gail's frustration was understandable. Women's wrestling in WWE at that time was poorly handled. Many talented performers were wasted. The division needed better booking, better stories, better respect. Gail wasn't wrong to be frustrated, but her method guaranteed she would never return while Vince was in power. She embarrassed his company in front of millions. That was unforgivable. It didn't matter that she had legitimate complaints. It didn't matter that the women's division was poorly booked. What mattered to Vince was that she made WWE look bad. She broke the illusion. She showed disrespect on live television. Gail went on to have a great career elsewhere. She went to TNA, which later became Impact Wrestling. There, she was treated seriously. She had great matches. She won championships. She became a centerpiece of their women's division. She showed what she could do when given real opportunities. But in Vince's world, she was dead to him. She had committed the cardinal sin, public embarrassment, and Vince never forgave that. Number 8. Dusty Rhodes. Dusty Rhodes was a legend before he ever worked for Vince. He was the American dream, a son of a plumber who became a wrestling superstar. Dusty was huge in the territorial wrestling days. He was a star in Florida, in Georgia, in the Carolinas. He was beloved by fans. He represented the common man, the working class hero. His promos were legendary. His charisma was undeniable. He was everything a wrestling star should be. But Dusty represented something Vince wanted to destroy: the old wrestling system, the territorial era, the traditional way of doing business. Before Vince expanded nationally, wrestling worked differently. Different promoters controlled different territories. They had agreements. They respected boundaries. A wrestler might work in multiple territories throughout their career. They would move from region to region, building different characters, working with different opponents. It was a system that had existed for decades. It worked. It made money, but it was decentralized. No one person controlled everything. That system frustrated Vince. He wanted national domination. He wanted one company to rule all of wrestling. When Vince expanded in the 1980s, he crushed those territories. He raided their talent. He ran shows in their cities. He drove many promoters out of business. The territorial system collapsed. Dusty Rhodes fought back. He was running one of those territories. He believed in the old way. He valued the relationships between promoters. He thought Vince's expansion would kill the wrestling wrestling business. In many ways, he was right. The territories died, local wrestling cultures disappeared, but Vince won. His WWE became the dominant force, the only major game in town. Years later, Dusty worked for WWE in creative and developmental roles. He helped train young wrestlers. He contributed to storylines, but the tension never fully disappeared. Dusty believed in character-driven stories. He valued emotion and connection. He thought wrestling should be about people connecting with characters, about fans caring what happens. His creative philosophy came from the territory days, from a time when wrestlers built characters over months and years in front of the same fans every week. Vince wanted something different. He wanted corporate control. He wanted spectacle over substance. He wanted big moments and shocking twists. He wanted to manufacture stars rather than letting them develop naturally. Their philosophies clashed constantly. When Dusty suggested old-school booking, Vince often rejected it. When Dusty talked about emotional storytelling, Vince wanted more flash, more entertainment, more sports entertainment, as he called it. The old rivalry lingered in every meeting, in every creative session. Even when they worked together, Vince could never fully trust Dusty. Dusty represented a world Vince had conquered but never truly understood. Vince won the war for wrestling's future, but Dusty was a reminder that something was lost in that victory. The personal connections, the regional loyalty, the slow build, storytelling. Vince's WWE was bigger and richer than the territories ever were, but it was also more corporate, more manufactured, more controlled. Dusty represented authenticity in a world Vince had made artificial. This wasn't hatred like with Nails or Savage. This was ideological conflict. This was two men who represented different eras of wrestling, different philosophies of the business. Vince respected Dusty. He employed him for years, but he could never fully embrace what Dusty represented: the past, the tradition, the way things used to be before Vince changed everything. Number 7, Ultimate Warrior. Ultimate Warrior and Vince had a relationship built on money fights. From the very beginning, it was transactional. Warrior was a massive star in the early 1990s. He had an incredible look, muscles upon muscles, face paint, tassels, high energy. He would sprint to the ring, shake the ropes violently. His entrance alone was memorable. When he wrestled, it was pure intensity, short matches, big power moves. The crowd loved it. He was different from everyone else, unique, marketable. Vince saw dollar signs. Warrior was pushed as the next Hulk Hogan. At WrestleMania 6 in 1990, Warrior defeated Hogan for the WWF Championship. It was supposed to be a passing of the torch, the old champion giving way to the new. Warrior was the future. He was supposed to carry the company for the next decade, but there was a problem. Warrior wanted to be paid like Hogan. He demanded equal money. He felt if he was the champion, if he was the top guy, he deserved top guy money. From his perspective, this made sense. He was doing the work, drawing the crowds, selling the tickets. Why should he make less than Hogan? Vince disagreed. He felt Warrior hadn't earned Hogan's pay yet. He felt Warrior needed to prove himself over years, not months. The negotiations were constant, and they were hostile. Warrior felt disrespected. Vince felt manipulated. When they couldn't agree, Warrior walked out, just left, stopped showing up to events. This happened multiple times throughout the early 90s. Warrior would walk out over money, Vince would suspend him or fire him. Then months later, they would negotiate his return. He would come back, work for a while. Then another money dispute would arise, and the cycle would repeat. The fights weren't just about money. They fought over merchandising royalties. Wrestling merchandise was huge business in the 90s. T-shirts, action figures, posters. Warrior felt he wasn't getting his fair share of merchandise sales. He claimed Vince was cheating him, keeping money that should have gone to the performer. Vince countered by publicly alleging that Warrior's absences were linked to steroid use. He suggested Warrior was unreliable, unprofessional, difficult to work with. He painted Warrior as the villain in their business relationship. Warrior refuted these claims. He said Vince was in breach of contract regarding merchandise. Payments. He claimed he had documentation proving he was owed money. The accusations flew back and forth for years. Neither man fully trusted the other. Every negotiation was a battle. Every contract was a temporary truce. For VKM, Warrior's demands represented an attack on the company's internal financial structure and employee hierarchy. He couldn't allow one wrestler to dictate terms. If Warrior got everything he demanded, others would demand the same. The power structure would collapse. Despite the years of acrimony, the conflict was ultimately transactional. It was about money, not personal hatred. This became clear when WWE produced the self-destruction of the Ultimate Warrior documentary in 2005. It was brutal. It was a hit piece. Former wrestlers were interviewed saying negative things about Warrior. Stories were told that made him look bad, unprofessional, selfish, difficult. The message was clear. Warrior was the problem, not Vince, not WWE. This was Vince's revenge for years of contract disputes. A documentary designed to destroy Warrior's legacy. But time heals financial wounds, especially when money's involved. In 2014, WWE inducted Warrior into the Hall of Fame. He gave a speech. He made peace with the company, with Vince. Warrior appeared at WrestleMania that weekend. He was on Monday Night Raw the next night. It seemed like the grudge was over. Tragically, Warrior died days later from a heart attack. He was only 54 years old. His reconciliation with WWE happened just in time. The Warrior story demonstrates something important about Vince's grudges. When the fight was purely financial, forgiveness was possible. Warrior cost Vince millions with his walkouts. He caused booking headaches. He made threats and demands. But it was all about money, about contracts, about business terms. There was no personal betrayal, no family insult, no physical attack. So eventually, when both men were older, when enough time had passed, they could do business again. Warrior's cultural value returned. His name still meant something to fans. Nostalgia made him profitable again. So Vince forgave, because forgiveness could be monetized. Number 6, Scott Steiner. Scott Steiner was outspoken. He was aggressive. He was unpredictable. He didn't hide his feelings about anything. When Steiner had a problem with someone, everyone knew. He would say it to their face. He would say it in interviews. He would say it on social media. He had no filter, no corporate polish, no carefully managed public image. That personality made him exciting, dangerous, unpredictable, but it also made him difficult, especially for someone like Vince, who valued control above everything else. Scott Steiner came from a legendary wrestling family. He and his brother Rick were the Steiner brothers. They were one of the greatest tag teams in wrestling history. They worked in WCW, they worked in WWE, they worked in Japan. They had success everywhere. Scott was incredibly strong. He could throw wrestlers around like they weighed nothing. He had legitimate power, but as his career progressed, Scott became more volatile, more outspoken, more willing to burn bridges. Their relationship started fine. Vince liked the Steiner brothers. They were talented. They drew money. They had credibility. When they worked in WWE in the early 90s, things went relatively well. But as time went on, Scott's personality became an issue. He said things that made management uncomfortable. He refused to follow scripts exactly as written. He pushed back against creative decisions. In WWE's system, this was problematic. Vince demanded obedience. He wanted wrestlers who followed directions, who stayed in their lane. Scott Steiner wasn't that guy. The relationship soured into what was later described as the most hated relation. Scott became hostile toward Vince and his family. He made politically charged comments about them. He criticized the company publicly. But unlike some wrestlers who whisper complaints backstage, Scott said everything loud, on camera, in shoot interviews, on social media. He called out the McMahon family directly. He questioned their business practices, their ethics, their treatment of wrestlers. He held nothing back. Vince hated this. Scott was unscripted chaos. He said whatever he wanted. He couldn't be controlled, couldn't be managed, couldn't be predicted. For a man like Vince, who built his empire on controlling every word spoken on his television shows, Scott Steiner represented a nightmare, a loose cannon who might say anything at any time. So Scott became an outsider. He was blacklisted from WWE for years. He worked elsewhere. He had success in TNA, but WWE's doors were closed, not because of lack of talent, but because of personality conflict, because Scott refused to be controlled. But something interesting happened. After Vince stepped away from power, the Steiner brothers were inducted into the Hall of Fame. This happened in 2022. Vince had lost control of WWE by then. He was still involved, but no longer the sole decision maker. New management made different choices. They could look past personal grudges that Vince had held. They could do business with people Vince personally disliked. The Steiner induction proved something important. Many of these grudges were personal to Vince. They weren't company policy. They were ego battles between Vince and individual wrestlers. Once Vince lost absolute power, reconciliation became possible. The company could work with people Vince hated. They could recognize accomplishments Vince had ignored. This shows how much his personal feelings shaped WWE for decades. How many careers were limited not by talent or drawing power, but by whether they offended Vince personally? Scott Steiner was talented enough to be in the Hall of Fame for years, but it took Vince losing power for it to happen. That says everything about how Vince operated. Number 5, Cesaro. Cesaro was incredibly talented. His real name is Claudio Castagnoli. He came to WWE with an impressive resume. He had worked in Europe. He had worked in independent promotions across America. He had proven himself everywhere he went. When he arrived in WWE, fans and wrestlers immediately recognized his ability. Cesaro was strong, incredibly strong. He could lift and throw opponents who outweighed him by 50 pounds. He made difficult moves look effortless. His strength was legitimate. Not just wrestling strong, actually strong, but Cesaro was more than just power. He was athletic. athletic. He could wrestle any style: technical wrestling, high-flying moves, power moves, brawling. He adapted to any opponent. He made everyone look good. Other wrestlers loved working with him because they knew the match would be great. Fans appreciated his skill. They recognized they were watching something special. Cesaro consistently had some of the best matches on every show he was on. By every measurable metric, he should have been a main event star. But Vince didn't see it. Vince didn't see a star when he looked at Cesaro. He saw a good worker, a solid hand, someone useful for the mid-card, but not a top guy, not a main eventer, not someone to build the company around. And in 2014, Vince made his feelings public. He appeared on the Stone Cold podcast with Steve Austin. It was a rare interview where Vince spoke candidly about WWE. Austin asked about Cesaro, about why he wasn't being pushed to the main event. Vince's answer was devastating. Vince said Cesaro was physically talented. He acknowledged the strength and the ability. Then he added a but. He said Cesaro lacked charisma. He said Cesaro didn't have the it factor necessary to connect with the audience. He used that phrase specifically, the it factor, that nebulous, undefined quality that Vince claimed some people had and others didn't. According to Vince, Cesaro didn't have it, and without it, he could never be a top star. This statement came directly from the CEO of the company on a podcast that thousands of people would hear. It was a career death sentence. That statement became Cesaro's career ceiling. No matter what he did after that, those words hung over him. When he had great matches, people remembered Vince said he lacked charisma. When crowds chanted for him, people wondered why Vince didn't see what everyone else saw. When other wrestlers praised him, it didn't matter. Vince had spoken. And in WWE, Vince's word was law. Once he decided you didn't have it, you were never getting to the top. The ceiling was set. The judgment was final. But this public critique served another purpose. It was a defense mechanism. Vince used this strategy often throughout his career. When a talented wrestler didn't reach the main event, Vince blamed the wrestler. He said they lacked charisma. He said they couldn't connect. He said they didn't have the it factor. This deflected criticism away from WWE's creative failures. It shifted. Blame from the company to the individual. The narrative became this: if a highly skilled athlete failed to reach the main event, it was the performer's personal shortcoming, not the company's lack of creative direction, not the poor booking, not the failure to build stars. It was the wrestler's fault for not having that mysterious it factor. This was convenient for Vince. It meant he never had to take responsibility for wasted talent, for poor creative decisions, for failing to elevate performers the audience clearly liked. He could just say they don't have it and move on. But the truth was more complicated. The truth was simpler. Vince had a very specific vision of what a star looked like. Muscular in a specific way, tall, charismatic in a very particular style, usually someone who could cut promos like a comedian or an action movie star. If you didn't fit that exact mold, you were labeled deficient. Cesaro didn't fit Vince's mold. He was bald. He was European. His English was good but accented. He wasn't a natural promo guy in the way Vince valued. He was a wrestler first. And in Vince's WWE, being a great wrestler was never enough. You had to be an entertainer, a sports entertainer, as Vince called it. You had to talk. You had to have catchphrases. You had to fit the exact template Vince had in his mind. Cesaro didn't fit. So instead of adapting the system to utilize his talents, Vince dismissed him, labeled him without it, and kept him in the mid-card forever. Cesaro's career suffered not because he lacked talent. Everyone knew he was talented. It suffered because he didn't fit Vince's narrow definition of a superstar. And Vince would rather hold someone back than admit his vision was limited, than admit that maybe different types of performers could be stars, that maybe the audience might value something different than what Vince wanted them to value. Vince's ego couldn't allow that, so Cesaro remained stuck, a victim not of his own limitations, but of Vince's refusal to see past his own biases. Number 4, Christian. Christian was Edge's tag team partner. They were both talented. They both connected with audiences. But Edge became a world champion. Edge main evented WrestleMania. Christian never reached that level in WWE. Why? According to multiple sources, Vince didn't like Christian's face. He didn't like Christian's look. It was that simple, that shallow, that arbitrary. Vince told commentator Todd Grisham to undersell Christian's entrance. Grisham was instructed to say it's Christian with no excitement, no energy. Just acknowledge him and move on. This was active sabotage. Christian left WWE and went to TNA. There he became a world champion. He main evented shows. He proved he could carry a company. But when he returned to WWE, the same ceiling remained. Vince's aesthetic prejudice hadn't changed. Christian's story reveals something disturbing about Vince's leadership. Talent didn't always matter. Performance didn't always matter. Sometimes your career was decided by whether Vince liked how you looked. This wasn't a meritocracy. It was a dictatorship of preference. And if Vince decided he didn't like your face, your potential was capped forever. Number 3, CM Punk. CM Punk was a rebel. He spoke his mind. He challenged the system. In 2011, he delivered the famous pipe bomb promo. He sat on a stage and told the truth. He criticized WWE. He criticized Vince. He talked about favoritism. He talked about part-timers like The Rock and Brock Lesnar taking spots from full-time wrestlers. It was raw. It was real. Fans loved it, but it was also a warning sign. Punk was frustrated. He was burning out. The company ignored his health problems. They ignored his complaints. By 2014, Punk couldn't take it anymore. After the Royal Rumble, he walked out. He went home. He was done. Vince's response was cold. Despite attempts to calm things down, WWE fired Punk on his wedding day. Let that sink in. They chose his wedding day to terminate him. That wasn't an accident. That was calculated cruelty. It was revenge. But the fight didn't end there. WWE's ringside doctor filed a defamation lawsuit against Punk. Reports suggested Vince may have supported this lawsuit. He used corporate resources to punish someone who left. Punk's crime wasn't just walking out. It was intellectual rebellion. He publicly exposed how the company operated. He challenged Vince's creative judgment. He made Vince look bad. For that, Vince demanded the severest punishment. The grudge lasted years. Only after Vince left WWE did Punk return. In 2024, CM Punk came back to wrestling, but not while Vince held power. This proves how personal the hatred was. Vince couldn't let go. He couldn't forgive someone who made him look foolish. Even when it cost the company money, even when fans wanted Punk back, Vince's ego mattered more than profit, at least in this case. Number 2, Nails. Nails had a short WWE career, but his exit was explosive. In 1992, after SummerSlam, Nails got into a pay dispute with Vince. He felt he was owed money, so he confronted Vince backstage. The confrontation turned violent. Nails grabbed Vince by the throat. He choked him. Other people had to pull Nails off. Then Nails broke free and choked Vince again. This was a physical assault on the company's CEO. Nails later said Vince had squashed many careers. He said Vince ran into the wrong guy, someone who wasn't afraid to fight back. But Nails didn't stop there. He called 911 from the venue. He filed legal charges. He made a bizarre allegation that Vince had molested him. This claim was never proven. It was widely dismissed, but it escalated the situation beyond repair. Niles was immediately and permanently blacklisted. He never worked in major wrestling again. This case drew a clear line. Vince would tolerate many things. He forgave wrestlers who cost him millions. He forgave people who jumped to rival companies. But if you physically attacked him, you were done. If you threatened his safety, there was no second chance. No reconciliation, no forgiveness, ever. Number 1, Randy Savage. This is the deepest grudge, the most personal, the most mysterious. Randy Savage left WWF for WCW in 1994. When he left, he took the Slim Jim sponsorship with him. That hurt WWE financially. But many wrestlers jumped to WCW. Hulk Hogan nearly destroyed WWF by going to WCW. Yet Vince eventually forgave Hogan. He brought him back multiple times. But Randy Savage was different. Vince never forgave Randy. Not while Randy was alive. Not for 17 years. This wasn't about business. It was personal. Vince felt Savage betrayed him like a brother would. Savage had been a cornerstone of WWE. He was a main eventer. He was trusted. His departure felt like a knife in the back. But the grudge went deeper than that. For years, dark rumors circulated in the wrestling community. Rumors involving Savage and a young Stephanie McMahon. These rumors have never been verified. They are often dismissed as internet speculation. Most people doubt they are true, but the intensity of Vince's hatred gave those rumors life. Why else would Vince hold such an extreme grudge? Why would he refuse to reconcile with a deceased man? WWE aired segments mocking Savage. They created a character called Nacho Man to make fun of him. This was petty. This was vindictive. Vince used his television platform to insult someone who couldn't respond, someone who was no longer even in the business. This went beyond professional rivalry. Savage died in 2011. He was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2015. 4 years after his death, Vince finally allowed it. But by then, Savage couldn't enjoy it. He couldn't reconcile with his old friend. Whatever happened between them, Vince took that secret to his grave, or at least out of his company. The hatred was so strong that even death didn't soften it for years. Let's step back and look at the pattern. These 10 wrestlers reveal the truth about Vince McMahon's leadership. He operated on a forgiveness index. If you made him money, almost anything could be forgiven. Hulk Hogan nearly bankrupted WWE by jumping to WCW. Hogan came back. Brock Lesnar walked out multiple times. He came back. Bret Hart was involved in the biggest biggest scandal in wrestling history, he came back. But if you crossed certain personal lines, money didn't matter. If you physically threatened Vince like Nails did, you were gone forever. If you allegedly crossed family lines like Savage supposedly did, you were erased. If you publicly humiliated him like Punk did, you stayed banned until Vince lost power. The wrestlers who suffered from aesthetic bias, like Christian and Cesaro, faced a different kind of hatred. It wasn't about revenge. It was about Vince's rigid vision of stardom. He believed in a specific look, a specific style. If you didn't fit that mold, you were labeled deficient. Your skills didn't matter. Your connection with fans didn't matter. Vince's personal preference became your career ceiling. This reveals how arbitrary his system was. Talent was subjective. Success depended on whether Vince liked you. The business grudges, like those with Ultimate Warrior and Dusty Rhodes, show Vince's territorial nature. He viewed business challenges as personal attacks. When Warrior demanded equal pay, Vince felt disrespected. When Dusty represented the old territorial system, Vince saw an enemy. These weren't just contract disputes. They were threats to Vince's authority, and Vince never forgot threats. Former WWE creative team members described the environment as one of the worst they had ever seen. The culture was toxic. Fear ruled the locker room. Vince encouraged ambition, but only on his terms. He told wrestlers to grab the brass ring, but when they tried, he often punished them. The rules were arbitrary. The expectations were impossible. Failure was blamed on the talent, never on creative. This created a workplace where resentment festered, where grudges became inevitable. Vince's management style was volatile. He mixed real-life tensions with television storylines. The Montreal Screwjob created the Mr. McMahon character. His real feud with Stone Cold Steve Austin became the foundation of the Attitude Era. Vince turned shoots into works. He weaponized genuine conflict for profit. This strategy made him very rich, but it also left a trail of damaged relationships, broken trust, permanent enemies. Many of these grudges lasted decades. The Ultimate Warrior feud spanned from the early 1990s to 2014. The Randy Savage grudge lasted from 1994 until 2015. The CM Punk situation lasted from 2014 to 2024. These weren't brief disagreements. They were sustained campaigns of animosity. Vince held grudges longer than some people stay married. His memory for perceived slights was extraordinary, and his capacity for revenge was bottomless. But Vince's power is gone now. He stepped away from WWE amid serious allegations of misconduct in recent years. The company is now run by TKO. The new management operates differently. They don't carry Vince's personal grudges. That's why CM Punk could return. That's why Scott Steiner got his Hall of Fame induction. The removal of Vince's personal influence allowed for reconciliation. This proves how much of WWE's culture was directly tied to one man's ego. His feelings shaped careers. His grudges determined futures. His preferences built some people up and tore others down. Looking at these 10 names, a question emerges. How many careers did Vince ruin with his pettiness? How many talented performers never reached their potential because they didn't fit his narrow vision? How many grudges were held for reasons that had nothing to do with business? Christian could have been a world champion. Cesaro could have main evented. Rusev could have been a top star. But Vince's ego got in the way. His need for control. His inability to let go of personal slights. The wrestling business has always been carnivalesque, larger than life, dramatic, but Vince took it further. He made backstage politics into blood sport. He turned personal relationships into weapons. He used his platform to settle scores. The 10 wrestlers on this list aren't just victims of bad booking. They're casualties of Vince's personality, his vindictiveness, his volatility, his need to dominate every aspect of his empire. Some of these stories have happy endings. Bret Hart reconciled and got his Hall of Fame moment. Ultimate Warrior made peace before he passed away. CM Punk returned to wrestling and found success again, but others never got closure. Randy Savage died before true reconciliation happened. Nails was erased from history. Christian never got the run he deserved. The damage was permanent. The opportunities were lost forever. Vince McMahon built the biggest wrestling company in the world. He created WrestleMania. He turned wrestling into mainstream entertainment. He made billions of dollars, but he did it at a cost. The cost was measured in broken relationships, in careers cut short, in talent wasted, in grudges held for decades. The 10 names on this list are proof. They show that Vince's empire was built on more than just business decisions. It was built on personal vendettas, on ego battles, on a management style that valued control over fairness. These grudges defined careers. They shaped the industry. They created stories that fans still talk about today. The Montreal Screwjob is legendary. The CM Punk walkout is infamous. The Randy Savage mystery is enduring. These moments happened because Vince made them personal. He couldn't separate business from emotion. He couldn't forgive slights. He couldn't let go. Now that Vince is gone from power, WWE is changing. The culture is shifting. Old grudges are being resolved. Blacklisted names are returning. The company is moving forward. forward. But the legacy of Vince's grudges remains. These 10 wrestlers are part of wrestling history now. Their stories are cautionary tales. They show what happens when one man has too much power, when ego trumps talent, when personal hatred shapes professional decisions. The pattern is clear. Vince forgave those who made him money, Hogan, Lesnar, even Bret Hart eventually, but he never forgave those who threatened his ego, who challenged his authority, who crossed personal lines. Nails attacked him physically. Randy Savage allegedly crossed a family boundary. CM Punk exposed him intellectually. These were unforgivable sins in Vince's world. Money couldn't fix them. Time couldn't heal them. Only Vince's departure from power finally closed those chapters. For the aesthetic victims like Christian and Cesaro, there was no real crime, just bad luck. They didn't fit Vince's mental image of a star. They were collateral damage in a system that valued subjective preference over objective talent. Their punishment was wasted potential, careers spent below their ceiling, success denied not because they failed, but because Vince decided they weren't good enough before they even started. The business fighters like Ultimate Warrior and Dusty Rhodes represented challenges to Vince's authority. Warrior wanted equal pay. Dusty represented the old world Vince destroyed. These conflicts were about power, about who controlled the wrestling business. Vince couldn't tolerate challenges to his dominance. He had to win every battle, had to maintain absolute control. Grudges were the price of defiance. This list of 10 wrestlers tells the story of Vince McMahon's reign. Not the official story, not the sanitized version, but the real story, the one about grudges and egos, about power and control, about a man who built an empire but left behind a trail of enemies. These 10 names are monuments to that legacy. They're proof that Vince's hatred was as legendary as his success. The wrestling world has moved on. WWE continues without Vince. New stars are rising. Old grudges are being forgotten, but these 10 stories remain. They're part of wrestling lore now. They teach us that talent isn't always enough, that fairness doesn't always prevail, that sometimes the wrong person gets too much power. And when that happens, careers are destroyed. Potential is wasted. Grudges last forever. Vince McMahon named 10 wrestlers he hated. Some he hated for business reasons, some for personal reasons, some for reasons we'll never fully understand. But the hatred was real, the consequences were severe, and the legacy is permanent. These 10 wrestlers paid the price for crossing Vince McMahon. Their stories are the dark side of wrestling history, the side that reminds us that behind the entertainment, real people suffered real consequences. Not because of what happened in the ring, but because of what happened in Vince's mind. The era of Vince's grudges is over, but we'll never forget the casualties. The 10 wrestlers who learned the hard way that Vince McMahon's hatred was as powerful as his vision. They're part of wrestling history now, forever linked to the man who built an empire and crushed anyone who stood in his way. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Vince's most infamous grudges, hit that like button and drop a comment telling us which story shocked you most. We'll see you in the next one.